The year is 1842. The place, a plantation on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. And the woman who lived there was about to become the most feared figure in the entire county. But not for the reasons you think. This is the story of Margaret Thornwood, a widow, a mother, and a woman hiding something so sinister beneath her mansion that when the truth finally surfaced, it would shake the foundations of Southern society forever. Margaret Thornwood wasn't born into wealth. She clawed her way into it. Married at 16 to tobacco plantation owner Samuel Thornwood, a man 40 years her senior. A man who, neighbors whispered, had buried 3 wives before her. Samuel died in the winter of 1839. Heart failure, the doctor said. But the servants who worked the estate? They told different stories. Stories of screaming that came from the master's bedroom that final night. Stories of Margaret standing over his body with an expression they couldn't quite explain. No one investigated. No one dared. Because Margaret Thornwood had just inherited one of the wealthiest plantations in Georgia. Within weeks, something changed. The house staff, 12 servants who'd worked for the Thornwoods for decades, began disappearing. First, it was the groundskeeper, Thomas. Then the head housemaid, Eliza. Then 3 more. The local sheriff came asking questions. Margaret met him at the door, dressed in black silk, her face a mask of grief. They ran north, she told him, her voice smooth as honey. Seeking their freedom, I didn't have the heart to stop them. He believed her. Everyone believed her. After all, she was a respectable widow, a woman of standing, a woman of God. But something dark was growing inside that house. By the summer of 1841, Margaret Thornwood had become a ghost herself. She rarely left the mansion. She took her meals alone. At night, neighbors reported seeing multiple candlelights moving through the house, flickering from room to room, floor to floor, and down into the cellar. Always down into the cellar. A delivery boy named Joshua was the first outsider to sense something was wrong. He'd been bringing supplies to the mansion twice a week. But on one particular afternoon in August, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Singing. Not Margaret's voice. Multiple voices, men and women, coming from beneath the floorboards. But the singing wasn't joyful. It was desperate, broken, like a prayer from people who'd lost all hope. He ran to the sheriff, told him everything. But once again, Margaret was ready. When the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, she welcomed them inside with tea and fresh-baked bread. She showed them every room, every closet, every corner of the house. "Would you like to see the cellar as well?" she asked, her smile never wavering. They went down, lanterns held high, and found nothing. Wine racks, preserved foods, stored furniture covered in white sheets. Empty. "Satisfied, gentlemen?" Margaret asked from the top of the stairs, her silhouette blocking the light. They were. The delivery boy was labeled a liar, a troublemaker. He was run out of town within a week. But what the sheriff didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Margaret had been listening at the window when Joshua went to report her. She'd had 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to move them. Move them where? October 1842. A woman named Catherine Brennan arrived at the Thornwood plantation. She was Margaret's cousin from Charleston. She'd written ahead, but Margaret never replied, so Catherine came anyway. She knocked on the heavy wooden door. Once, twice, no answer. "Margaret?" she called out. "It's Catherine. Please, I've traveled 2 days to see you." The door slowly creaked open. Margaret stood there, gaunt, pale, her dress dirty and torn at the hem. Margaret looked like she'd aged 20 years. Her hair, once pinned perfectly, now hung loose and gray. Her eyes were hollow, sunken. But when she recognized Catherine, something flickered behind them. "Fear. You shouldn't have come," Margaret whispered. "You need to leave, now." But Catherine pushed inside. "I'm worried about you. The letters I've received from neighbors say you've become a recluse, that you've—" A thump came from below, then another, then scratching. Both women froze. "What was that?" Catherine asked. "Rats," Margaret said quickly, her hand gripping Catherine's arm. "The house is old. They're in the walls." But Catherine knew the sound of rats. And that wasn't rats. Catherine's eyes drifted to the cellar door. It was shaking. Something was pushing against it from the other side. "Margaret, what's down there?" "Leave," Margaret said again, but this time her voice cracked. "Please, Catherine, if you care about me at all, You'll walk out that door and forget you ever came here." But Catherine didn't leave. Instead, she did something that would finally expose the truth. She lunged for the cellar door and ripped it open before Margaret could stop her. Darkness. Then slowly, candlelight illuminated stone steps descending deep, deep underground. What Catherine saw in that cellar would haunt her for the rest of her life. 23 people, men, women, and children, restrained and confined, emaciated, covered in filth, some barely conscious, others weeping when the light hit their faces, light they hadn't seen in months. Weak voices called out, "Please, please help us." Catherine stumbled backward, hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. These weren't strangers. Catherine recognized them. The house staff who'd supposedly run north. Field workers who'd vanished without a trace. Even 2 white overseers who'd questioned Margaret's management of the plantation and then simply disappeared. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, completely still. No denial. No excuses. Just silence. "Why?" Catherine finally choked out. "Why would you do this?" For the first time, Margaret looked almost relieved. "Because they knew," Margaret whispered. "They all knew what I did to Samuel, and if I let them go, I'd hang, so I kept them, fed them just enough to keep them alive, moved them through hidden passages when people came looking, and I would have kept them forever if you hadn't." Margaret's face twisted from relief to rage. Her hand shot out, grabbing a fireplace poker from beside the door. "I can't let you leave either, Catherine." What happened next was chaos. Catherine screamed and ran not toward the exit, but toward the front study, where she'd seen a loaded rifle mounted above the fireplace. Margaret was faster than she looked. Decades of rage and paranoia had given her a terrible strength. She swung the poker, missing Catherine's head by inches, embedding it into the wooden doorframe. Catherine grabbed the rifle, spinning around, barrel pointed at Margaret. "Stop!" Catherine shouted. "Don't make me do this!" The rifle fired. Smoke filled the room. Margaret crumpled to the floor, clutching her shoulder. Blood spread across her black dress, but she was laughing, actually laughing. "They won't believe you," she hissed through the pain. "I'm a widow, a woman. You think they'll hang me? They'll say you're hysterical. They'll say you're jealous. The gunshot had been heard by a passing merchant. Within minutes, men from town arrived, and when they descended into that cellar, there was no denying it anymore. Margaret Thornwood's trial lasted 3 days. She never showed remorse, never explained herself fully beyond that single confession to Catherine. The defense argued she was mad with grief, that a woman couldn't possibly be responsible for such calculated cruelty. But the evidence was overwhelming. The survivors testified. The hidden passages were discovered tunnels running beneath the entire mansion, connecting to a root cellar 100 yards from the house. That's where she'd hidden them when the sheriff came. On November 3rd, 1842, Margaret Thornwood became the first woman in Georgia to be sentenced to death for crimes against both enslaved and free persons. Her last words were chilling. "I regret nothing. Samuel controlled me for 10 years, and I outlived him. They all would have exposed me, and I outsmarted them. If I'd been a man, you'd call me clever." Justice was served, but the horror of what happened in that mansion would never be forgotten. The Thornwood plantation was burned to the ground by locals within a week of Margaret's execution. They said the evil had to be cleansed. Today, nothing remains but a stone foundation and whispered stories. But Margaret Thornwood's case teaches us something crucial about history that we must never forget. Evil has no gender. For centuries, society refused to believe women could commit calculated, violent crimes. This assumption allowed countless abuses to continue unchecked. Margaret used her societal position as a respectable widow as a shield, a manipulation that kept her victims imprisoned while the world looked away. The assumption that women were incapable of such cruelty created a blind spot that cost 23 people months or even years of their lives. Isolation enables monsters. Margaret's wealth and social standing created a bubble where she operated without oversight. Her victims had no voice, no legal standing, no way to seek help. This remains painfully relevant today. Abuse thrives in silence, in places where power goes unchecked, where vulnerable people have no recourse to justice. Whether it's a plantation in 1842, or a workplace institution, or home in our modern world, unchecked authority creates the conditions for horror. Believe the witnesses. Joshua, the delivery boy, told the truth but was dismissed because his word didn't match Margaret's social status. Throughout history, victims and whistleblowers from marginalized communities have been silenced by those in power. How many other delivery boys have we ignored? How many voices have been dismissed because they didn't come from someone society deemed credible? The cost of disbelieving victims is measured in human suffering. Documentation matters. Catherine's immediate report and the physical evidence left no room for denial. In cases of abuse, documentation, photographs, written accounts, physical evidence becomes crucial when confronting systems designed to protect the powerful. The survivors' testimonies, the hidden tunnels, the physical conditions of that cellar, these facts couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Class and respectability are not indicators of character. Margaret Thornwood wore the finest dresses, attended church, maintained the appearance of propriety. But beneath that veneer was something monstrous. We must be vigilant against the assumption that wealth, education, or social standing somehow prevent people from committing terrible acts. Evil often hides in plain sight, wearing a mask of respectability. These 23 people had names, families, dreams. They weren't just statistics or plot points in a horror story, they were human beings whose lives were stolen from them. Thomas, the groundskeeper, who loved to carve wooden toys for local children. Eliza, the housemaid, who sang hymns every morning. The others whose names history didn't preserve. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims of one woman's cruelty, but as individuals whose voices were finally heard even if it came too late. The Margaret Thornwood case reminds us that darkness can wear any face, speak with any voice, and hide behind any facade of respectability. Our job, our moral obligation, is to listen to those crying out from the cellars, literal and metaphorical, before it's too late. To question authority when something feels wrong. To believe victims when they find the courage to speak. To demand accountability regardless of who holds the power. Because beneath every monster's mansion, there are always victims waiting to be found, and sometimes the only thing standing between them and freedom is our willingness to look beyond appearances and listen to the truth. The Thornwood mansion is gone, but its lesson remains. Stay vigilant, question everything, and never ever assume that respectability equals innocence. Because sometimes the greatest evils wear the most beautiful masks.